joining us. We have the author of our reading selection, Rebecca Frank. So Rebecca, if you want to say a quick few words to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Frank. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. I'm also affiliated faculty with ICPSR, the data repository here on campus, and the Einstein Center Digital Future in Germany. So I'm a little bit of everywhere. And I believe the paper that you guys wrote today is one that I really love talking about with people, about the sort of main area of research that I do, which is thinking about risk as a social construct in digital preservation and curation, and what it means to think about risk as something social in that context. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us. So we've got a few different questions we can put out there. I think the format of the meeting is going to be pretty open discussion. But we could kind of start by framing the research paper that Rebecca authored in the sense of both track and trusted digital repositories and kind of like the definition of risks that I think, two definitions of risk really that are out there right now. And one that's kind of like a primary has been being used, or it has been a primary definition of risk versus socially constructed risk. So there is a quote here in the notes that I highlighted in bold, and I'll just go ahead and read that to kind of get us started. It's down here, I'll highlight it. Despite the centrality of risk in digital preservation and trusted digital repository certification, the discipline continues to rely on an outdated understanding that treats risk in a probabilistic, deterministic way rather than engaging with the extensive bodies of research which demonstrate that risk is socially constructed. So we have two definitions, and breaking down each one of them, what it looks like. Rebecca constructed this model that actually shows a variety of 8 different factors that go into the social construction of risk. And then through this paper, correct me if I'm wrong, but you divided these out into primary and secondary. And then, what does that mean in terms of when this paper was written? What does it mean to, as we're going forward? Things are constantly changing, obviously, both at an organizational level, policy level, technology level, political environment, culture, like all these things are constantly changing. So I think that's, we really want to kind of open up the discussion on all those points and, go through some of these questions and by all means, have anybody chime in whenever they want to. So, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to unmute. And I guess what we'll do is maybe start off with the first question that we put out there. So unless anybody else has anything else they want to jump in with right away, I'll just ask that. Okay. Let's see. The first question that we put out there was, the author finds that out of a group of 8 factors which influence risk perception, communication, expertise, uncertainty, and vulnerability were most prominent, while complexity, organizations, political culture, and trust played more limited roles. So this initial question that we put out is really, given the recent pressures acting on the GLAM community that align with the latter factors, how do you perceive their degree and method of influence going forward, and specifically on how we define risk? So I will open up the floor with regard to that and to see what people are thinking. And we can also kind of put an icebreaker out there. So I'll just kind of like jump in and say, there are obviously so many factors that are influencing us in a cultural means, in regardless of which country we reside in, and yeah, it feels like, without putting too fine a point on it, we are essentially experiencing a lot of pressure in terms of being able to do our research, fund our research, and continue to evaluate the landscape when it comes to actually certifying digital repositories and what those methods and means mean. It's just uh, from the standpoint of a repository like at CDL that has gone through the Core Seal certification, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. It is also one of those things where um, it is not a cost-free effort either. And so, regarding budgets and other things like that, we need to make sure that that's in alignment. But it's a really, really important aspect to us to continue our certification. In fact, our certification is going to be coming up for renewal next year. So it is on my mind, or on the team's mind, that how we construct the idea of risk while we go through this next certification is going to be different than it was the last time. I'll kind of stop there. But
Can I jump in and sort of say something about this first question, Eric?
Sure, go for it, Flavia. How are you doing?
Okay. Yeah. Hi there, everybody. I haven't come to any of these groups, but dealing with risk and risk analysis is partly in my role at the Academic Preservation Trust, and I'm curious. I totally admit I didn't have a chance to read the paper. I didn't know that this was a thing until Nathan sent it to me late Friday. But this particular thing, but this gathering to speak about it. But I think that I'm a little perplexed because, and maybe I'm not understanding the context, because certainly there are social aspects, even when we talk about particular threat actors and so forth. This is the idea of how people do phishing, and how they use perception as what's a safe email or not. We know that sometimes they send things that are horrible, but if we think probabilistically of risk versus I am in California, what's the probability of our repository being affected by an earthquake versus, say, on the coast of Virginia? There are differences. So I think that maybe I'm not understanding the context for this, because I do feel when risk is discussed, there are absolutely social and cultural aspects that are looked at for probabilities of, again, threat actors or even what we perceive as risk versus things that are natural events and very scientifically oriented. So maybe I'm missing something. I'm not quite sure what what is being looked at here that is a little bit different than that perception that of risk and my familiarity with the TDR documentation. Hopefully that helps get something going.
I'm happy to jump in and chat about that unless anybody else would like to add anything. Okay. Um, so I will say, I think so the definition that I'm working with of risk, and when I talk about risk as a social construct, um, what I'm saying isn't that people like that probability changes, right? So that sort of like probability, magnitude of consequences equation isn't wrong. I think it's just not the full picture. So when I say risk is a social construct and social factors matter, what I'm saying is when you present two different people with that same probability information, they're going to behave differently in response to that information based on a bunch of things which fall under the 8 factors in this in this model. And that's what I found through this research, was that the same risk with the same sort of probability, for some people feels like a crisis, and for some people feels like that's manageable. I don't need to change my behaviors on account of that. And so it isn't saying that the sort of classical, like really numbers focused definition of risk is wrong. I just think that when we're really thinking about long-term preservation outcomes, it doesn't give us a full enough picture to really understand how people are going to interpret that information and behave based on it.
Great, thank you. That absolutely makes sense. And it's why there's qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question.
And jumping in really quick for further clarification, I'm Aurora. I'm from Ohio University. It's nice to meet everybody. But correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't your paper very focused on the fact that these evaluation metrics that are being used to certify institutions are approaching risk in this quantitative way rather than embracing the social aspects of it as well?
Yeah, definitely. So this study, and also actually the one I did after this, which looked at our trust seal, is looking at the certification process specifically. Um, but I also spent some time within that research asking folks about long-term preservation, sort of independent of certification. But it is saying that our the way that we are, I'm saying we as part of the digital preservation community, but the way that the preservation community within certification is choosing to make claims about our trustworthiness for long-term preservation, I think is relying a lot on numbers and not taking those human elements into account. So you're correct.
Okay, Stephen, you have your hand up.
Yes, so my apologies. Maybe I should have raised my hand earlier because maybe this is like a question zero, but I have, and I'd like to hear everyone, and particularly Rebecca, is a question of the language that's being used here. Not that I object to it. I understand absolutely what's being said, but it strikes me that what's being socially constructed, or what's most meaningfully about a socially constructed phenomena, is not so much the risk itself, a particular situation or phenomenon. It's the tolerance of risk that is really the thing that's for the most part varying, across institution, across individual, across program, and so forth. And I don't know if that, I mean, I know you, like your abstract, you have so many words, only so many words, so you have to pare it all down. You don't have time for that nuance. But I know later, throughout the article, you often qualify. You don't just talk about risk, you talk about perception of risk, which to me, again, I think is getting to this notion of tolerance. For a given phenomenon, for whatever reason, I have more latitude than someone else. I don't live in an earthquake prone area, so I don't worry about that. It's not that the fact that earthquakes happen on the West Coast is a construction, that seems to be sort of a geophysical fact. It's the relation, the geographic relationship that the program has to that fact that leads to a different perception or tolerance of risk.
Sure. Um, so I would say that I think you're partly right, and I'm going to push back a little bit partly. So I think there is one argument to be made that everything is risk tolerance from 0 to 100. And our tolerance might be really high if we perceive that the risk is almost nothing, right? But to use the earthquake example, so what I'm saying isn't that the fact of being in an earthquake zone means then you understand there's an earthquake risk and you behave in a particular way. What it says is, so based on people's lived experience, for example, let's take the vulnerability factor here. People who are socially or economically vulnerable tend to view risks as less tolerable, to perceive greater risk, to behave differently than folks who have more power or authority. And some of that is about whether they choose to accept risk or not. So if you're a person for whom risk is an exciting opportunity, and if something doesn't work out, you'll be fine, tend to have like a very different willingness or tolerance of risk. Or they tend to if it's not a risk, it's an opportunity that may or may not pan out. Whereas folks who are not able to weather that chance as much tend to have a more, not alarmist, but like a stronger view of what risk might happen. So, and an example that I am not pulling from research, I'm just making up in my head, if we follow the earthquake example, is somebody who is wealthy, lives in a home that is a new construction with a lot of earthquake preparedness built in, might say like, well, and if an earthquake comes, if you need to rebuild, you rebuild. If you need to repair, you repair. But we're pretty earthquake tolerant. And the last one that happened, I was fine. So I think, we don't need to the sky isn't falling. But somebody who lives in an older building, somebody who can't afford to rebuild, somebody who was maybe displaced for a very long time after a previous earthquake might say, we have to do absolutely everything we can do to prevent any kind of disruption. We need to be so prepared. It's absolutely devastating if an earthquake hits. You can't recover well, right? And so those two people, you can frame it as risk tolerance, but you could also frame it as like one person viewing something as like a huge risk, and one person viewing something as an opportunity instead. And so that's the sort of part of this picture. It's not only tolerance to risk, it's about whether something is viewed as a risk at all or the cost of doing business. But I would love to hear others' thoughts on that.
One thing that comes to my mind, and please, if anybody else is going to jump in, I can stop. I'll take a back seat. There's a part of your paper that goes into the potential of having data stored in 2 different countries, and I think that kind of adds to this example where for us, in any case, at one point we were considering, well, we use a cloud storage provider that has a facility in Amsterdam. And so Amsterdam is, of course, susceptible to flooding. And we did a little bit of research and found that their infrastructure was well guarded against that. But then ultimately, kind of what turned us away from that was literally, cost really, and speed and transfer of data across such a great distance. So, but it does feel, as you're saying, it does feel like a very kind of personal definition of risk for each individual involved, whether they're part of the repository or whether they're, say, for example, an auditor in this case, or a developer of the criteria, right? So I think that's what I also found is that you were pointing out in more than one section that there were conflicting, not conflicting, but just different definitions that each group of individuals had, and that they put different priorities on different things. And so, yeah, we definitely do that, and we have knowledge of certain things, and then of course we don't have knowledge of other things that we could be completely missing. So that of course adds to the equation as well. But
Esty, I can go. Yeah. Thank you so much for pulling this together today, by the way. I really appreciate it. And Rebecca, it's wonderful to read your work. Appreciate you being here too. It's great to pose some of these questions with you in the room, virtual room. The thing that I like hearing that about, like, kind of the social dimension, particularly like different perspectives and understandings and people, like what people bring to the table. But then I was really struck by the section on the repository processes and how different individuals experience the, like, just in their kind of the technology and their understanding of how it relates to the broader, how it's achieving the kind of the standards for long-term preservation, and that complexity of like the workflows and the processes. And that to me seems to be a really interesting place where some of these dimensions, particularly like people may feel like they don't have the expertise they need, and they may feel vulnerable and even bringing up like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right, or I don't understand this process. And then that role of communication when you're dealing with people from across organizations who have different types of roles and expectations, like even within the microcosm of a particular institution or organization. Like that really stood out to me as something where like, thinking about broader risk, but also just that the fragility of these workflows and processes that we have. So I don't know if I have a question there, but that's just standing out for me as something I'm really pondering from your work.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. Um, I will say in this paper and from this study, um, the organizations that I was looking at were quite large, well-resourced places where some that sort of like technical work questions, there was not a lot of uncertainty about like, do we have the expertise we need in a lot of cases? Uh, and I think the auditors also trusted like the that this sort of is a solved issue in these places. Not that it necessarily was, right? But in the particular context of this research, um, a lot of the sentiment was, and this is why this complexity ended up as a secondary factor instead of a primary factor, was that technical problems are solvable if somebody would give us money. Um, I probably have a quote somewhere where somebody says that almost exactly. Another paper from this study talks about types of risk that I identified, and financial was one, and repository processes, which most of that falls under, was another. And really, like the repository process is risk. Um, was a lot about complexity and a lot about we need enough money to hire someone with the expertise to be able to do this. But if we can, this is doable. And so I found a lot of that. Um, findings were a little bit more mixed in the study I did about core trust seal. And those papers are currently under review. Hopefully they will be ready for you all to read in a few months. But the repositories were smaller in that case. And so these questions about processes and technical things came up a little bit more.
Okay, and Mark, I'm going to just hop over to Leslie's comment in the chat really quickly, and then I'll ask you to chime in if that's okay. So Leslie has a great note in the chat saying there are outliers. With NARA as a federal agency, I have little to no choice in my risk tolerance. I work in a regulatory environment that sets the levels for my risk tolerance, even though I can identify additional specific risks not in place for other federal agencies, which is a very good point. It's a completely different perspective in that sense, or a different perspective in that sense too. So let's see, Mark, you had raised your hand?
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, thanks for the article, Eric, and so Robin as well for getting us together again. I think this is really fun. I was really struck by, the different perspective of the actors in these vignettes, and kind of reminded me of the parable of, three people trying to describe an elephant, having very different perspectives on what they are able to see and understand. I was wondering though, if you came across anything in your new research about having a common understanding of risk. For example, we had a new state law regarding web accessibility. And so, there was a lot of probably others in the call here that had the same sort of challenge of, what content goes into the repository because they want to take it down quickly and get it off the sites. If you came across anything like that of having a real understanding of something that is perceived as a high risk and wanting to take action on it.
That's a great question. I don't know that I have any specific examples off the top of my head that I can share about behaviors in response to particular risk. But I have two thoughts that might be helpful for you. So the first is in the context of this research, an interview that I did early as sort of a pilot was with a repository that had good disaster planning stuff in place, and at one point asked their IT folks, like, could you, like, this is our plan. How can we restore from backup? And they said, of course, anybody who's competent can restore from backup, no problem. And they said, great, do it. Pretend like we lost everything. And it took a very long time, like months and like several months, I think. And they almost were able to restore everything. And so they learned quite a lot from that process. And I think it's a great illustration of this idea of the social construction of risk, of like, what would you need to be able to recover? How serious is this problem? Folks with a lot of expertise said this is not serious. There's a process. This is how you should do it. It should be fine. But then, of course, it was very challenging, which I'm sure is not surprising to anybody here in this space. So I think part of the question is how serious do we think something is, and who understands it as something very difficult versus something very commonplace, which I think actually gets to Leslie's comment a little bit. And I think it's a great point that there are organizations that have really tried to minimize the impact of those social factors by taking some decision making out of the process. I think we could talk for a long time and make a strong argument that they're still present even within those structures, although they do a lot, I think, to help minimize that. The other piece I will say is you're correct. I found really big differences between repository staff on one hand and auditors and standard developers on the other. In Core Trust Seal, where the auditors are drawn from a pool of already certified repositories, what I am finding tentatively is that the process of shifting your perspective to that of auditor moves people closer to the auditors and standard developers. So those groups then have more similarity in how they understand risk, as opposed to repository staff. So the more ways you engage with the standard, the more you trust it and think that it's doing what it says it's doing effectively and correctly, which has been really interesting.
Robin?
This was a very thought-provoking paper, and I know that you're highlighting things that you see through research that have sort of been overlooked or de-emphasized or left out altogether as part of the way we look at risk. For years, I worked in IT, wasn't part of the library scene, and I remember at the time, we would talk about policies, and we're very reluctant whether to create a policy, especially around security, because so often once you create a policy, then people are just trying to find ways to work around it. Or there's always things that you've forgotten, and people get super comfortable with the policy and have this false sense of security. And your paper made me think a lot about that and the value of whether you get certified or not. And I wonder if anything came up around that, around people having a false certainty of some kind of trustworthiness when actually it's more like a speed bump, right? It's like, yeah, you achieved a certain amount of stuff, but that doesn't mean that you're never going to be at risk, right?
That is such a great question, and I think you've like really cut to the point, like the heart of a lot of what I'm doing. Um, so what I have found sort of over and over again, and it's in this paper and it's in others from this study and from the subsequent work I've done, um, is that the folks on the ground in the repositories doing the work who are not involved in developing the standards and doing the audits, um, very much have this idea that like, well, this is a great snapshot, and certification is maybe less of a description of how well prepared we are for risk to manage risks than it is a tool to help us manage risks by demonstrating that we do things well and enabling us to get funding. But tend to say like all of the documentation and policies and things we've had to put together do not actually change our long-term preservation outcomes. Whereas the folks who developed and the standard and administered the audits have said, if you meet these criteria, then you are well prepared. Like we can trust that your content will survive long term. And I got a lot of pushback from folks in repositories. Succession planning was an area in particular with a lot of pushback. And what I heard about succession planning was if we, the repository that is the repository for this content or this community or whatever, can't keep the lights on and we shut down, who is going to care about our community more than us and be able to take care of our content when we can't? How are they going to muster funding that we couldn't for this community? And also, if we are gone, the legal agreement, succession agreements we've signed are completely unenforceable. And so it's a nice document to have in place. That means absolutely nothing. And it was a very interesting perspective. I had one interviewee who had very strong feelings, but it was a sentiment I heard in more moderate ways throughout. This sort of idea that like we've created a policy because we needed it to become certified, but do we think that it will actually do what it is supposed to do? No. Which is very interesting.
Now read Leslie's note from the chat here. Given what you said about communication issues between repositories and auditors over time, such as communicating about new risk findings, do you think that any of that relates to a lack of ongoing risk reassessment?
That's a great question. I think in a lot of ways, those communication problems that I identified in this study have been really addressed really well in other certifications. So Core Trust Seal has a really specific and clear schedule of reviews. This particular, and I think also the ISO 16363 certifications also have a very clear schedule. It was this particular implementation of track where that was an issue. And I don't see it in other places moving forward. But I do think in the interviews that I did, repositories that were waiting to be contacted for a reassessment, who were waiting to do new sort of risk assessment activities. And of course, they were never going to be contacted. And so the risk assessment activities were on hold unnecessarily. Or there were places that were moving ahead and doing those things in anticipation of certification, but not sharing that information. So I think there were a bunch of issues around certification process things that probably impacted risk assessment activities in repositories. I'm going to say mostly negatively, but probably in some places positively as well, right? The anticipation of having to do another certification and the memory of how time consuming it was meant that some places were trying to stay on top of it in anticipation of having to go through that again, even though they wouldn't.
Right, and actually one of the things that often comes up, you mentioned that in Core Trust Seal, the auditors were the review board essentially, and they come from a group of repositories that have been certified. So in that case, I think it's in some ways to the advantages of the folks who have been previously certified, that they're thinking about how can these requirements for certification change, what can we do. They are, but on the other hand, that schedule, that 3-year schedule that's out there, when they actually recertify, they may be doing that amidst the update process of the requirements. And so they may be certifying against the old requirements just as the new ones are coming out. And that, for me, in any case, like when I saw the new requirements come out for Core Trust Seal, there were so many things that made more sense there. And I assume, or am hoping, that the new requirements are going to be even more like applicable. So I guess, there's no good and bad here, but I think, we're going to be thinking about both sets of requirements. And then, as we move forward for the next 3 years with regard to being, the team that maintains the repository, we're going to be thinking about different features that could benefit us for the next set of requirements. So all of that kind of comes into like, how do you prioritize things that are going to mitigate risk and what's most important to do. So yeah, lots to think about. So I did want to kind of, since we are an infrastructure and interest group, maybe wrap us back towards a little bit of infrastructure. There was one of the questions we put out there with regard to, and this has to do with funding, with technology, advances in technology, and also the perception of how this technology may or may not be beneficial. And of course, kind of, the elephant in the room there is AI. And I haven't seen a whole lot of, I guess, apart from vendors, commercial vendors that are able to take advantage of AI and try to immediately integrate different AI processes into their software, for an academic driven or an academic based repository like ours, we're well aware of the different risks of introducing AI in any of our processes, and whether or not we want to automatically do anything, or whether or not our depositors and the upstream curators really want that to happen. So I think the question that is in the back of my mind, if I wanted to, or if we wanted to integrate AI, for example, specifically with regard to format identification or format migration or any of that sort of thing, how far do we take that integration? B, how can we best incorporate the community-based resources that are out there, like Pronom and any other, major file format signature resources? Where's the infrastructure? The infrastructure does or does not exist yet. All these things that you think about, like, it would be great if we could use something like Google's, what is it called? Magica, like, AI-based format identification, but then stitch that together with, an agent that goes out to Pronom and gets all the latest information and kind of like bring all that together to just make suggestions to our collection owners about what they may want to do, to better position their collections and content for future access. There are so many little overlaps and other things and all of that where you could say, oh my gosh, this is too risky. Oh my gosh, nobody's ever done this before. What should we even consider taking on? Do we have the resources, obviously, to take any of this on? Are we familiar with AI? It's just, right. I guess all those sorts of things, all those thoughts come up. And I'm just curious if anybody else out on the call has started to consider those sorts of integrations and risks that are associated with them.
I'm Sheena Scott with Anderson Archival, and I've actually been looking into all the AI stuff, and one thing I found is there is no good way to easily integrate it. But one of the things we definitely look at is the risk of content being used, the risk of how secure and how private is our content if we're using a commercial product. And so that is one of the bigger worries we have, is that privacy aspect.
Right, absolutely, I completely agree. You're engaging, you have the potential to engage with tools that are not entirely under your control. And so what does that mean for copyright and privacy and everything else? So, yeah.
Yeah, as we pursue or as tool integrations are furthered, one of the things that I am very, very wary of, and I think a lot of places are trying to go to lengths to mitigate this possibility, but AI agents can change the metadata on files. Things can be altered on the back end, potentially without you knowing about them if your logging isn't very, very good. And we already see this sort of issue, like Windows loves to change file metadata. It adores it. Google Drive, SharePoint, all of them are really, really good at changing the internal technical specifications of what you're working with. And so they're already doing that. And as a born digital archivist, I do not have the confidence that current AI tools are capable of really not doing that, or that they're going to be designed with with digital preservation in mind. I've seen, like, there was a recent story a few months ago where a company's entire database was deleted by an AI accidentally. And I just look at that and fear.
Right, right. That's frightening. And that, perhaps some of that is also a result of the immensely quick churn we're seeing in AI right now, accelerated development and how things are changing so much because, models change all the time, activities change all the time. The potential for agents to do different things is probably increasing and increasingly complex. So that could have been a very terrible side effect. Oh, thanks, Rory, for the link. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Wow. So just real quick, yeah, I guess I'd get pretty upset if something went in and randomly deleted a database. So, but that's very fascinating to understand about the metadata. This is where, I realize that I'm probably, Rebecca, I'm more in the line of the person that maybe was saying, sure, we can do a restore. I admit for being more cautious, but understanding what, the fact that it was going in and changing metadata, yeah, Microsoft is bad about that. But the things that I rely to hear from you all about is something to watch out for when talking about these kinds of tools. Just a sort of thought, sorry.
I would maybe chime in. So from a sort of risk and social construction perspective, I think AI is such a great example of a bunch of those factors, right? So expertise influences how comfortable your organization might be in adopting AI technology, and willingness to use it or not. Um, Comfort with uncertainty, right? Willingness to take on uncertainty, or to trust that you'll be fine. Um, Different types of uncertainty being more or less appealing, or um, at least like not as scary. Um, Things like vulnerability, right? Um, you might be a person who feels like AI is really exploitative in your community, and you might really be unwilling to work with it in other contexts. Um, but also, what I found in the certification landscape is that, especially in the sort of early days of certification, which this study was trying to capture, larger repositories with more resources and more technical expertise often framed their participation in terms of like, we can we can do this as a part of our service to the broader community to develop this into something workable for smaller organizations, right? In the context of certification, not AI, right? We can do certification now when it's still really untested, when the outcome and the value proposition are uncertain. Like, we can take on the risk of putting a lot of time and resources into this so that it becomes something for the whole community. And I suspect that what is happening around AI may be a little bit of the same, right? Some places can take on a little bit of risk or opportunity in ways that places that are more risk averse maybe aren't or can't. So I think it's an interesting sort of example to think through, like, who might view AI as an opportunity versus a risk, or for folks who think about the risks associated with it, which ones are the risks that are most salient for them given their organization, their personal lived experience, all of those things. So I was really excited about this discussion question that you sent me because I think it's really interesting to dig into.
So we're getting close to the top of the hour a little bit. I think we should, I'll put a last call out there for questions for a moment, if anybody has anything they want to type in the chat or discuss.
I just had a quick question for Rebecca. Again, thank you for this work, and forgive me because I didn't have a chance to read your paper. This is all great stuff and very relevant to somebody like me. So thank you. Did you find, these are some interesting stories. Did you find out of some of these different stories that people would recognize, for example, hey, maybe we should be testing this more? So you talk about some very confident central IT people that were like, sure, we can restore this. Part of our disaster recovery planning should be that we have a testing process for doing that. And did you find that as you were looking at even the risk tolerance that you're talking about, that through that kind of noise, I say, and it's not noise, I don't, that kind of chatter, is that people were still thinking very much about, yeah, but we still have to have these processes, this sort of analytical cold aspect of we must have these processes.
No. Not a lot. I mean, I agree with you. So I think part of what I found was that because repositories rely on people like folks with an IT background, folks who are really sort of digital preservation kind of policy focused, and larger sort of organizational admins. Those are three fields that each have their own views about risk, and their own understanding about what kind of risks you're facing and how you deal with them. And what I found was that it was those folks in the middle, the digital preservation folks, who really wanted everything to be very well documented. And folks in like the top and bottom, right? The admin and the IT, not that it's a top, but just the order.
Yeah. The different roles.
Tended to view the time it takes to document processes as sure, if you have the time on top of your regular responsibilities, do it. And of course, nobody did. Part of what people said was valuable about certification is that it gave the organization a reason to let people spend a portion of their time documenting all these policies and processes that hadn't been well documented before, and that nobody was going to have the time to do without a business reason to do it. But even just documenting them, right, was a challenge. And so running drills or testing them or things like that, I did not hear about. But it's been a while, so maybe that's different now. I think you all might have a better sense of that than me.
I don't know how much it's changed in general. Over-resourced, under-resourced and overtasked, right?
Yeah. I think, I really did find quite a lot of that, right? It's everybody's trying to do a lot with very little. And certification was this thing that helped them make a case in a business sense, to implement some of these things and to document things that they wanted to do, but just hadn't been able to justify in the course of their work up until then. I think I'm almost at the end of you all's time. I will be at DigiPres next month, also talking about risk more. So if you have more questions for me, you can find me there as well, or you can reach me by email anytime. I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us, Rebecca.